Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cybersecurity Bridge podcast. My name is Jon Oltsik. I'm a former industry analyst and a current cybersecurity community activist. Before we proceed, I just wanted to let everyone know what the Cybersecurity Bridge is all about. It's a bi-weekly podcast where I have esteemed guests and we talk about an area of cybersecurity. And we talk about that in three different sections. We'll talk about the present, we'll talk about the future of that particular area of cybersecurity, and then the cybersecurity bridge. How do we get from the present to the future? What are the impediments? What are the drivers? Things like that. So I am pleased to have another wonderful guest, and it's Greg Bell, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Corelight. Welcome, 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 Greg.
Hey, John, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and to be included in your podcast.
Thank you so much. And give the audience an introduction. Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, I'm the co-founder. I was a second employee of Corelight, which is a network security company in the network detection and response category. Before that, I had a long career in government service, and I actually ran the global enterprise network for the U.S. Department of Energy, which connects the National Lab Complex with all the labs with each other and with the nuclear weapons complex. Very different kinds of organizations with different security needs, and that was the environment where the open source software that our company is commercializing was born and began to thrive early on.
That's great. And our topic is network security, so you are an expert. But before we get into that, are you ready to play cybersecurity trivia?
Oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting this. I'm as ready as I will ever be, John.
Okay, here we go. Here's the question. In 1990, this infamous hacker hacked into Pacific Bell's telephone system, took control of a radio station's phone lines, and became the 102nd caller in a contest to win a Porsche 944. Okay. He also hacked into the FBI. He was apprehended in 1991, convicted in 94, and spent 51 months in prison. Now, was this person Kevin Mitnick, Kevin Johnson, or Kevin Poulsen? And I'll give you a hint, it wasn't Kevin Bacon.
Wow, this turned out to be a softball. It was Kevin Mitnick, and I've read his autobiography, which is fascinating. I recommend to everyone, and is full of rich detail about the emotional and psychological dynamics in social engineering, and which is an important, very important aspect of cybersecurity we sometimes underestimate, right? So it's nice to be reminded of his amazingly creative and sometimes illegal activities.
Well, Greg, that's a good answer, but it's the wrong answer. It was actually Kevin Poulsen. And I understand the confusion because Kevin Mitnick did similar things, but it's Kevin Poulsen, who now writes for Wired magazine and wrote a great book called Kingpin, which I suggest everyone read. It's about kind of early days of cybersecurity carding, but interesting. So forget that. Let's move on to network security in the present. And I want to start by saying, when I started in cybersecurity in the early 2000s, network security was the hub. We had tools like Wireshark and Ethereal, and everyone looked at packets and PCAP, and they looked at NetFlow. And so now all of a sudden EDR came in and people kind of were a bit dismissive about network security. So what is the present state of network security?
Yeah, I mean, in a word, and by the way, my career mirrors that narrative that you just described. And in a word, it's cool again. And it's a really interesting turn of events for those of us whose careers are embedded in the history of network security. At the beginning, as you say, it was kind of all we had. We had the visibility that network security could provide, and it was easy to achieve that visibility because encryption wasn't so widespread. With the rise of EDR, people began to believe, conventional wisdom began to be that EDR was really all you needed, and EDR got to be pretty good. It's really very mature, effective technology, and attackers, being creative and well-resourced in many cases, have evolved in their techniques to respond and are going after systems that are not protected by EDR, making NDR a really critical component in a balanced security architecture and one that's rising in importance.
Yeah, so let me That was a great answer, but let me throw another kind of devil's advocate thing at you, and
Sure.
that is, but all the traffic's encrypted now, so we can't crack the packets or look at the packets like we used to. How does that influence the current state of network security?
It does. It has a big impact. And first of all, it's not true that all the traffic is encrypted. Although a rising proportion is encrypted, a surprising amount is still unencrypted. We know that from research partnerships we have with a subset of our customers, where we monitor their traffic, and we are able to assess the ratio that's encrypted and non-encrypted. We're also able to develop new detection methodologies in their networks with their permission. So not everything's encrypted, but a rising percentage is encrypted. And by the way, encryption is a good thing. It's really critical for assuring privacy, so we support it. But the dilemma remains. And so how do we try to tackle it? And there's a few techniques. When permitted by law and by policy, some of our customers will break and decrypt. So they'll decrypt a subset of traffic flows. And then the situation is similar to it was when we started our careers, when network security was king. In many cases, and by the way, in some cases, architecturally, it's even necessary for certain kinds of load balancing to decrypt. So that's another injection point. In some SASE architectures, it's possible to inject network monitoring for decrypted traffic. But let's take the hardest case where decryption just isn't feasible, it's not legal, it's not permitted. In that case, the key technique, and it's one we've applied a lot of our research team's resources to tackle, is to gather information in exquisite detail, to look at every bit on the wire and every bit of information we could gather that's contextual around those flows, and to wring every bit of insight we can, and to try to infer what's happening in the packet streams, even if we can't look inside. And the metaphor we sometimes use to describe that is a kid who gets an 8-year-old who gets a gift for his or her birthday, isn't allowed to open it yet, but shakes the box to try to figure out what's inside. And there's a lot that you can do by shaking that box. And we've spent quite a bit of time developing such technology. Our customers do appreciate it.
I like that shaking the box metaphor. I'll remember that. Talk to me about skill sets. Are the skill sets intact today to really understand what's going on the wire?
There has been a degradation in understanding of the basic facts of network protocols, and it's understandable too. Like a lot of the cybersecurity workforce is relatively young, and came of age professionally in an era when EDR was more dominant. And so there's a bit of a learning gap, and then also, of course, there's an enormous skills gap in cybersecurity generally. And so we're seeing the need for younger professionals to learn a little bit more about network protocols, which are a bit complex and obscure, and they require some learning. There's also some promise that new technologies like generative AI can help bridge that gap or accelerate learning processes. So I'm excited about those prospects.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll get to generative AI, so hold that thought.
Hold my horses. Okay.
What about SASE? So the thought of moving network security to the cloud, combining services, certainly we've seen some vendors be very successful with that. How is that? What's the impact of that today, and what's the impact of that on Corelight?
Yeah, there's some great advantages and then some gaps that it leaves. Let's think about it from the customer's perspective first. There's a lot of advantages to centralizing all those connections, often remote office connections or remote worker connections, and to treating them as a block with security policies and detection. In the sort of first generation of SASE architectures, there was also a visibility gap that was created. So large organizations that depended on network telemetry that they could gather about their employees' online activities, and they would use that telemetry maybe to monitor insider risk and to do threat detection generally. They lost that visibility when migrating to SASE solutions. And however, in the last couple of years, most of the prominent SASE providers have announced integrations that make it possible for NDR companies like ours to be integrated into SASE architectures. And as I mentioned before, sometimes actually to access those traffic streams with customer permission when they've been decrypted. That's optional. But in a sense, it makes network detection even better in that SASE environment than it would be on-prem. And in many cases, too, other aspects of the connections can be provided by the SASE platform, like human identity. So you can get network telemetry that is integrated with information about human identity, which is really useful from a security perspective. So it's like an evolving series of architectures that are leading towards something a little more integrated, where network security gets integrated into a new cloud-based architecture. And that's kind of the future. Network security is integrated into switches, into Kubernetes, into cloud architectures. It's not the traditional network security, of 20 years ago. It's a much more modern flavor.
Well, you're anticipating the next section of our talk, which is about the future. But let me ask you one other question. So network security and cloud computing. So all these resources are in the cloud. They're very application-centric. How does network security and specifically network monitoring play?
Yeah, I think we're still figuring this out. There's a certain conventional wisdom in the cloud that networks have gone away, but in fact, it's still the same network substrate. It's just someone else's network. The same vulnerabilities exist. Sometimes there's a new class of vulnerabilities, but some of the same vulnerabilities still exist. And the network security mechanisms that are native to cloud platforms are actually fairly primitive. The data that's collected is coarse. It's sometimes delayed by 10 or 15 minutes. It's sometimes sampled. And so there's a bit of a gap in network visibility in most cloud architectures. And it's a bit like the SASE story, where that gap is beginning to be bridged. Most of the cloud platforms have native APIs for acquiring network packets. We have customers running our technology, I think, in all the major cloud providers and getting great value. And we're working through, we as a industry are working through the question of what it means to evolve NDR, network detection and response technology in cloud context. But there's just no doubt it's needed for the same reason that network detection and response has become so important on-prem. The threat actors have evolved to deliberately bypass the controls that exist in the cloud and on-prem. And so we just need a new class of tools to help shine the light on their activities.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you telegraphed what the future will look like a few minutes ago. But let's look 2-3 years out, look into your crystal ball. What can I expect as a practitioner for network security?
I think if you're a practitioner, say you're working in the SOC, you're a level 1 analyst, level 2, I just think there's hard to imagine an environment you might be in where LLM assistance isn't part of your world. And that is just, it's going to be profoundly impactful. And it's a little bit like the question of network security in the cloud. You can look around you and see all of the players in the industry, large and small, working to figure this out in real time together. There's great potential for removing drudgery from human work, for focusing valuable human cycles on problems that really require human analytical skills. And there's some risk too, some obvious and some non-obvious. But I just think this is the direction we're headed there, full steam ahead. And at Corelight, we're working. Right before this conversation, I was in a fascinating meeting about multi-year view of the application of generative AI to our own technology. And I know meetings like that are occurring all over the place in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so let me ask you another specific to the future. So one of the things when we started to talk about SASE was this is an opportunity to, and I'm going to emphasize this word, finally bring networking and network security together. So not only the technologies, but the individual groups. Have you seen that happen, and do you see that continuing into the future?
We are beginning to see that. And, I came up through the networking silo and at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is a remarkable jewel in our national lab system. And in that environment, the networking and security teams were really closely integrated, respected each other, and worked very closely together. Those conditions don't apply to every organization. Often there's a big wall between the two. But we do see among our customers, more and more the networking, we typically sell to the security team, to the SOC, but more and more the networking team is coming in, is getting curious about the data we provide and the applications of that data in their world as well. And also there's something that's a sort of at a micro cultural level. At a macro level, there's indications that large vendors are thinking about almost collapsing the distinction between networking and security and embedding security solutions into the fabric of networks. And Cisco has made some really interesting announcements in that regard. And so I think we can look towards a future when some of these traditional disciplinary boundaries are a bit dissolved, which is great. We need to think more holistically. We can't be slowed down by silos in our own organizations when the adversaries are so well motivated and so good.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Greg. I saw this with endpoint management and endpoint security probably 10, 15 years ago. And it made no sense to me that we had these artificial boundaries, we had artificial silos, different tools, different groups, different budgets. And it seems like that's organizational in nature, not based on need or requirements, or certainly not based on the threat landscape. So it's nice to hear that about the network.
We're beginning to see it. Ultimately, it's a failure of leadership, I think. You learn that in a startup. You get everyone focused on the mission, right? And everyone focused on the we. But it's as organizations grow and scale, those boundaries are almost inevitably develop, and so you have to have a strategy to break them down. And I am seeing evidence that that's happening.
Yeah, let's hope so, because I think that's important. But let me ask you this about the future. What's the role of regulations? Because we see things like zero trust being a very active initiative in the US federal government. We see NIS2 and protection of critical infrastructure in Europe. So network security, zero trust, how do those all play together with regulations?
Yeah, I think regulatory environments are really critical in sort of, I would say, especially if they're dynamic and they evolve a lot of feedback, you can gradually sort of, there can be an emergence of best practices that everyone can adhere to. And the critical problem is they can also be reified, right? And they can become, in the worst case, a kind of compliance checkbox sort of exercise. And so there's always, it's just a spectrum, right? You don't want a world of extreme overregulation. You don't want a world of zero regulation. You want a dynamic, evolving regulatory environment. But it's critical that some regulations and some best practices like that exist. Otherwise, everyone is reinventing architectures independently, and that's actually what will not help the cause of global defenders. There needs to be common standards, common architectures, open interfaces, and the exchange of information based on common assumptions. And actually, that ties back to our very emphatic emphasis on open source in our own technology stack, because open source has a real affinity to the idea of open regulation and the sharing of best practices.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I am always an advocate for open standards, open APIs, common transports, everything. And I think we as an industry do our customers a disservice there. So that's my public service announcement. But just this week, I read about a ransomware variant from Medusa, or maybe it was the Medusa ransomware, with a malicious driver that was an EDR killer. So that's clearly a way to circumvent or disable EDR. And so my question is, do you see that practice? Was that a one-off, or is that a practice you're seeing from threat actors? And for the future, do you see more of that? Do you forecast more of that?
It just seems part of that broader. I can't speak to the specifics of that of Medusa, but it just seems part of the broader trend that the EDR vendors themselves are illuminating, that the threat actors, including most notably the Typhoon threat actor, are doing everything they can to route around the difficult impediment of pretty good EDRs. You can do that in a number of ways. Certainly, you can create malware that disables or turns EDR off. But you can also focus on systems that are very unlikely to run EDR, network infrastructure. Some of those are so critical to the to the stability of the internet that they're not likely to be patched on a regular basis. There's two missions in conflict there. One is just production network transport, and the other is security. And so I think it's just one instance of a broader pattern of attackers evolving quite logically within their own logic to focus on what's easy to hit. And sure, we're going to see more of it because listen, there's just going to be a large subset of the global internet for the rest of our careers that isn't going to run EDR. There's an ever-growing multitude of small devices with embedded Linux running IPv6 that, I don't know how many are scattered around my office and home at the moment, but probably dozens. And each of them is a potential point of entry into an enterprise network. So we really need to think holistically about the data that we gather to provide defense for those environments. It just has to include network-derived data.
Right. The network is always the common element.
Yeah, it's very I hate to speak in absolutes, but extremely difficult to cross the network without leaving evidence. It's the medium of the attacks, right? It's the transport mechanism. There might be I'm still stinging that I got the Kevin question wrong at the beginning. There might be because I'm competitive, but there might be there certainly are other techniques, social engineering and others that don't involve a payload crossing a network, but in the general case, a payload of some kind crosses a network, and we need to be able to provide visibility and detection to catch as much of that as we can.
Okay, one more future question, then we'll move on to the cybersecurity bridge. But the future is, what's the future of Zeek? So for those of you who don't know, Zeek came out of Bro. Bro came out of, I think it came out of academia or the Department of Energy. You tell me, but what's the future of Zeek?
Yeah, this is the open source project that my co-founder Vern Paxson created when he was a postdoc or maybe a grad student at LBNL and UC Berkeley. And it's become, over the last couple of decades, the gold standard for making sense of network traffic. Speaking of standards, it's essentially the most common way for organizations to monitor traffic. And I'd say its future is quite healthy. Corelight is the business model for Zeek, and that's one of the motivations for getting the company started. So we employ the developers for Zeek, and they're really, really smart folks, and they're just constantly working on improving in various dimensions and keeping it modern so that it runs in cloud environments, so that it can run as fast as possible, so it can be adapted and extended as easily as possible to parse new protocols, maybe OT or IoT protocols. So it can integrate external sources of data. For instance, when it's running in a cloud environment or Kubernetes environment, it can suck in all the context from those APIs, or it can bring in context from EDR systems and enrich and extend the data it produces with all that additional context. That's stuff that Vern, when he was originally topping out the first few lines of code, never dreamt of. And our company is kind of a flywheel. We produce valuable products for customers, and we capture some value there, and we put it back into the open source project, into proprietary IP as well. And that's the flywheel that keeps this open source company running. So the continued health of Zeek is a big, big part of that story.
Yeah, and I'll just reinforce, I'm a big fan of openness, and open source is certainly in that space. So the cybersecurity bridge, this section, we talk about not where we are, not where we're going, but how we get to where we're going. And so let me pose this first question, because we've covered a lot of stuff. What's the biggest impediment to a strong network security future?
That's a good question. I really would have answered differently a couple of years ago. I might have said just consciousness that the category is still highly relevant outside the top 500 organizations in the world, where that consciousness was never really waned. Now I might say skills gap is actually quite a significant impediment. It's what we referred to earlier as a generation of early career cyber specialists who haven't been trained always to look at network traffic and to think about its incredible value in piecing together the narrative of a breach, and understanding the blast radius of a breach, and understanding if a breach has been remediated. So one of the ways we're trying to address that is to embed some of that expert knowledge using LLMs and other systems into our platform, so that especially junior engineers don't have to piece together that story themselves, but the story can be presented, and then they can think about the implications. So I think that's the problem, and it's the beginning of a technique for addressing it as well.
That also tells me, Greg, that there's an opportunity for cybersecurity professionals, maybe junior professionals, to specialize in network security because there's probably a shortage of experts there, and it's a good career path.
Yeah, I think that's right. It used to be that cybersecurity was more of a graduate level, I would say, or apex skill. So people would come through network operations, or they would come through, they would be a Unix or FreeBSD or Linux admin or an application developer and get to cyber. Now people are starting their careers with cyber because it is a discipline in and of itself. And it may be that some of them need to, think about just brushing up or learning network skills, especially in this age of stealthy lateral movement, because a lot of the evidence you're going to need to solve the hardest problems in your organization is going to come from network telemetry. So perhaps there can be a meet in the middle approach where the LLMs provide some real assistance and leverage, and humans do a little bit of learning themselves and kind of meet in the middle, and the two converge. If we can get there, we can solve what is currently a bit of a skills gap.
I think so, and I think some training, some specialization in that area would also be applicable. And one way to do that would be, I would assume, tell me if I'm wrong, but is to do some research around Zeek, see what's going on, see what the developers are doing, see what it can do, and learn that way.
Absolutely, Zeek.org. And then there's a whole open source ecosystem of security tools that are network security tools that are open source. One great example of that is Security Onion. They're partners and friends of ours. And if you want a quick way of just deploying a network security monitoring stack in your home or your environment or community college, you can get an ISO from them and download it and install pretty quickly. And you can get your hands on a bunch of network security tools, including Zeek. Or you can just work directly with Zeek. The Zeek community is vibrant. It's got a discourse, not a Discord, a discourse. It's got Slack. It's got friendly people helping you install it. A bunch of introductory videos. Richard Baitlick on my team has produced a bunch of them, and it's welcoming. So if you're interested, there are many ways to learn more.
I may do that. I may download that because I'm interested to see what my wife is doing on her system. She's on her system a lot, and maybe I can learn. Maybe I should anticipate an insider attack in my own home. So,
well, you're going to have to. Let's hope she's using encryption too, John. So you're going to come face to face with that dilemma we described earlier.
No, well, that's another discussion for another day. So let me ask you this about one of the things that a lot of people are forecasting are adaptive security tools, network security tools, specifically based on generative AI and based on agentic AI. Yeah. And as we kind of say, well, here's the bridge to the future. What role do those things play? Are they overhyped, or do you really see a role for them?
They might be underhyped, I have to say. I know there's a lot of hype and a lot of investment, but does the average person understand the difference between, say, their experience of ChatGPT and the promise of these agentic architectures where you get highly specialized systems that are composed and pipelined and that can do something a lot more like what the human brain is doing, which has specialized organs and systems? I just think they're radical in their implications. And it's a little hard to think clearly about the magnitude of the impact they will have, but I do wonder if it will be as large on human history as like the invention of printing. It's going to be pretty profound, and therefore all predictions are sort of complete speculation. But I'm pretty amazed by what agentic AI is capable of doing. When I talk to our board members and investors about companies they've invested in and proof points that already exist, it's pretty staggering. Actually, it raises an interesting question I was talking with a colleague about yesterday. If agentic systems and Gen AI more generally will begin to replace the drudgery of tier one, tier two analysts, and humans focus on the really hard problems, how do we train up analysts at tier three if the tier one and tier two work that used to be vital to get to tier three is being automated? My guess is there'll be a Gen AI answer to that too, where we'll have systems, expert systems for training and teaching and coaching humans, but they'll still be reserved for that really higher order work, which is the intersection of technology, policy, business logic, the stuff that humans are really good at and actually are probably a lot more inspired to work on than the mechanics of what a Suricata rule actually does.
I see the elements of what you're thinking about in cyber ranges. So an AI-based cyber range, a generative AI cyber range, or even agentic, because you and I may have the same job, but our skill sets are different. The way we learn is different. The tools we use may be different. So an adaptive model like that, I think, would be very powerful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good example of a learning environment that is, very realistic, adaptive. And if you're designing this, if you have a vision of what that might look like, it could respond to the learning preferences and styles of each person engaged in it. One thing I learned about recently from a large, I think I have to anonymize this, a large financial institution, is that they're running small language models to try to understand the behavioral patterns of their employees so that they can really make better decisions about what patterns are normal to their work and what might deviate and be evidence that they've succumbed to a phishing attack or something like that. And the idea of just minute customization, it's not a massive model that's looking at the entire organization with 100,000 employees, but it's a bunch of really small models, a little bit more like the agentic sort of architecture, focusing on how Jon typically interacts. And that's just an example of massive parallelism and automation that I think will be ubiquitous in a couple of years. But what happens beyond a couple of years, Jon? I don't know. We'll have to reconnect.
Greg, I don't know either, and that's why I always tell my guests, talk to me about the 2 to 3 year time frame, because if they start talking 5 to 10 years, we're gone.
I think that's right, especially in a period of such rapid, staggering change. It's just spitballing. So we'll see. We'll grope forward into the future, and all the elements of what we've discussed, from technology to policy and regulation, are really highly relevant as we think about the intersection of AI and security going forward.
There's a lot coming at us, but with that, we're out of time. But I want to leave the audience, as I do every episode, with what is the one thing that you would say to a CISO or maybe a practitioner today about network security? What's their priority? What should they be preparing for the future?
What I would say is start gathering the data now. They almost certainly have visibility gaps, and it's so easy to overcomplicate this question. We often think in terms of security cameras. If you're a bank and you have no security cameras, start with one. Put it in front of the vault or the front door or the back door, wherever you think is the most important place to put it. But by all means, start gathering that data as quickly as possible.
Greg, I could talk to you for another couple of hours because I have notes and notes, and I've lived in network security for years, but I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much. I look forward to talking again, Jon.
The pleasure was all mine, like I say, and join me again in 2 weeks for another episode of the Cybersecurity Bridge. In 2 weeks, I'll welcome a good friend of mine, Fred Wilmot, and we'll be talking about detection engineering. Thank you very much.